welcome to Glass Half Full Reviews, Game of Thrones TV review. And today I'm going to be reviewing the latest episode of Game of Thrones entitled Mockingbird. And I'm going to change things up yet again. This time I'm going to instead go... What's that? What'd you say? Oh, I hear. Yeah, that's a good idea. So, what I'm going to do this time is start from the least interesting storyline and then move to the most interesting storyline, in my opinion. So, I think we're going to end up with having a tie for first place. But I think you'll see when I get there. All right, let's get started. All right, so the least interesting storyline, of course, is the Jon Snow storyline. And it's not because the Wall is inherently an boring storyline. It's just that this is really just more like, okay, we know something's going to happen, but what? This all seems like there's not much there other than, I'm right, I do understand what's happening. I see that the point of this segment is to remind us that Jon Snow is still trying to do leadership things, and he's still being stymied on every turn by Alliser Thorne and Janos Slynt. And of course, it's important to keep those guys in mind for whatever reasons, so we can keep track of, okay, Jon actually has potentially some right ideas. Potentially. Although it's hard to tell. Of course, we see some of the politics going on, which, probably will be important later on. So I see why they did it. I just found this sequence a little dull, I suppose. I'd like to see a little bit more from Jon Snow, like stuff with his wolf, stuff with Sam, which we didn't see at all. I guess it's okay to have him talk about this stuff, and he made some good points. It just seemed like the way the whole thing was shot was kind of... We have to shove this in there. I don't know that it was really necessary. All right, that's really all I have to say about that particular subplot. Let's go on to the next one. All right, next subplot, Melisandre and Selyse. And, okay, so, again, I'm not saying that this is a bad scene, necessarily, and it's actually interesting because of the way it was contextualized with the episode. It will get to a segment I liked more later, but it does seem like, okay, well, all right, we guess we got to have a bunch of nudity. Now, the thing that I think was good, though, is that at least it made sense in a thematic way. I think it was very clear about how you had this sort of the interesting discrepancy between Selyse's religious fervor and her obvious kind of jealousy about Melisandre in terms of her physical appearance and her sort of wondering, what happened, and do I care, or do I not care? Because she clearly has this connection to the Lord of Light. So I understand why they did it. I get it, even though there was a lot of lingering, I suppose. And, I mean, it's fine, I guess. Better to have nudity that makes sense thematically than doesn't, which is all too often with this show, I think. But again, I'm not entirely sure why this scene needed to be there, except, maybe I just remind us a little bit more. All right, I guess I do see why, because there's this interesting insertion of the Shireen thing. And, of course, in the books, things the same? No, because this whole thing doesn't happen. So I really don't know where they're going to be going with this. I mean, obviously, considering what we've seen from Melisandre with people like Gendry before, she doesn't probably have the best intentions in mind for Shireen, but it's really hard to say. I don't really know where they're going to be going with the story for this. Probably not in a good place, but I really like that character, and I like the actress playing her. I think that she does a good job. I'm talking about the daughter. So that would be kind of sad to see something happen to a kid, especially one that I would not say is guilty of anything. So, with some of these characters, they've gone through certain things, and sometimes they're just sort of secondary ones where it's like, oh, kids, well, they died, but we've already built up a lot. I don't know. It seems like if they did do something bad, it would just be like a shock value thing. Not really something that I'm particularly looking forward to seeing if that is what happened. I guess it's just more table setting, more, let's extend out, remind people more of the Stannis stuff, and all right, let's keep it going. Oh, yeah, Stannis was at the Iron Bank, and here's what was happening in the same time. So I guess the segment wasn't quite as interesting to me. All right, moving on. All right, so I like a lot of the interplay between Brienne and Pod, and it was nice to see Hot Pie again. I did actually like a few of the things that happened. I'm not really sure where they're going with this. I feel like the lesson that Brienne is taking is, oh, it's okay to just talk about this. Of course, in the book, she does say it a lot, so I would say it's true to the character in the sort of like, oh, believing the best of people. I have to assume that it's going to pay off in a bad way, because not everyone's hot pie, obviously. But, it is interesting. The place that they were, the Inn of the Crossing, that is something that in the book shows up even more than here. And we've seen it a couple times. I guess it's nice to see that kind of thing. We don't really see those kinds of interactions. It was nice to see something from Hot Pie again, a guy who essentially escaped last time and didn't get involved in any of the further horribleness that happened later on. Of course, I do like the Brienne Pod back and forth. I guess the scene was fine. It was just one of these, okay, let's put something else in there. One of the problems sometimes with some of these episodes is it seems like they have to jam so much in there that you kind of get fragmented and you don't really get a good sense for individual character moments. So when they linger, which they do on certain parts of this episode, which I'll get to, and then you really have like a sense of continuity, and it's like, okay, you're getting a sense of the character. With the Brienne Pod stuff, a lot of it is just sort of building on what we know from them already, so I think it's sort of banking on that. And I'd like to see more extended periods, like they could have done more with some of the other scenes, like maybe with the Jon Snow one, or cutting that one out and this one and putting something else in there instead and extending some of the other scenes. I guess that this scene was fine. I just would have liked to have seen a little bit more expansive stuff. Maybe Brienne asking other places, other people. I suppose just one, because it's not really a good sample size. All right, moving on. All right, so getting back to our old buddy Daenerys across the sea. And there's a lot of things I liked about this sequence, and I did like how they had Dany kind of putting in her sort of control, like, okay, take off your clothes. Let's see if you're actually as good at what you're saying. And of course, this is the interesting thing that I was going to mention before, how they showed a shot of, well, somebody's rear end. I don't know that it was actually the actor who plays Daario. I don't really know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try that right now. But then, of course, they go right to Melisandre being naked in the next one. And I don't know if it was sort of like oh, see, we'll give him one for people who like both of those things. And I don't know. I mean, I don't have a problem with this particular actor's portrayal of Daario. Obviously, they couldn't keep the other guy because he left to be a part of the transporter. But I don't know. I guess sometimes I just don't see quite as much heat between these two characters as I feel I would like that would warrant this kind of interaction. I mean, it's fine. If they're just going to keep things more in a casual way, which is how it seems to me right now, then it's okay to characterize it like that. I guess I just don't want there to be a situation where it's trying to portray it as more than it is. On the other hand, I do feel like maybe there was a good way of showing that Daenerys was trying to distance herself by asking him to actually go out to Yunkai. And it was interesting the way, of course, they continue to do the stuff with Jorah, and it's like, oh, yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, just tell him it was your idea. Yeah, wink. So I guess I kind of like that. I like that continuing the complications of her various advisors. I actually want to see more of Barristan, because he's a really interesting character in a lot of ways. He has like a sort of like a legendary badass. And I just don't really feel like we have that quite enough. I'd like to see more of that. I usually watch the show with people who aren't as familiar with the books, so I get a good perspective on the stuff that people aren't as familiar with. And sometimes I have to explain a little bit of backstory, but I have to be careful not to, of course, say any spoilers for future things. Anyway, I'm sort of two minds about these scenes. I guess I understand why the stuff needs to be put in there, because there's so much else happening that we kind of need to see what's happening. And since there isn't like a huge thing that's happening right now with Daenerys, I guess we just need to keep checking in, the slow build. Alright, so the scene worked, I think, pretty well, but I would like to see, like I said, more interactions from some of our other advisors. I assume we'll see more stuff in the politics of Meereen later on, although maybe we won't see very much more from this season. I guess sometimes I worry about the interpretation of some of her later plot lines, because there's some kind of big things that happen, and they've already cut some of the characters out. So I just hope that they manage to do a good job with it. All right, next. All All right, so the Arya and Hound plotline, it's interesting because there is this really very philosophical thing that happens, and sometimes I find that a little heavy-handed, and it was a little heavy-handed, but it was all right because it was acted really well, and you get a chance to sort of see an exploration of both the changing of Hound and Arya's philosophical viewpoints, because Arya is getting much more nihilist. I mean, she's talking about, well, nothing is nothing, and the Hound is definitely getting more and more into, I guess, a softer perspective, a more sympathetic one. I mean, he started just as sort of a brutish monster, killing boys because Joffrey demanded he do it. And now, it's different. Now things have changed. I guess this has always been an interesting pairing. It's different at this point than it was in the books, but I feel like it's definitely going to the same place. I'm kind of curious what is going to actually happen with the later episodes, just because a few of the setups are a little different. I mean, these guys have always done a great job with the acting of these particular characters, and they have a really interesting rapport of the sort of interesting levels of sociopathy. Arya is continuing to go down that road, and the Hound is kind of lessening of that road. One of the important things I think that also they were doing here, which I'll be honest, I don't really think they did a good enough job in this season, is trying to set up the Mountain, the Hound talking about how awful he was. The truth is, in the books, the Mountain is a much more terrifying character, and when you start getting into the King's Landing stuff later on, and Tyrion's really worried, it's really, really legitimate about no one could possibly think of taking him on and living. And I'll get more to that later, but I guess I understand why they put that in, and they wanted to try to build him up more, but it seemed a little rushed to me. Like, well, okay, yeah, oh, that's right, he did this thing again. He just doesn't seem like such a monster to me. And in the books, it's a much different thing. Now, again, like I've said before, adaptation is free to be adaptation, but considering how it just seems to be, I feel like they kind of whiffed it a little bit on that front. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing to see the Hound give some of this backstory. In fact, I think it worked well. I'm just saying, in terms of the effects, it's not quite, I think, what it needed to be. Now, of course, there was the interesting little ambush later from Rorge and Biter, who, again, are very differently done in the books. I mean, I don't think that you would have really remembered, oh, wait, there's that guy who sort of looked weird, and then there was the guy with the teeth. I mean, they had a very short little thing at the beginning of the episode when they said the previously on. I was thinking, why are they showing that? That's like a season 1 thing. And then, of course, an early season 2 thing with Jack and Hakar, but I don't know, it just seemed out of place. And of course, we know why, because it paid off, because these are the two characters that attacked him. But then it just seemed almost like easy, a little too easy for Arya to kill him, considering these were supposed to be like horrible monsters. I can get why the Hound could potentially kill the other guy, but I don't know, the ambush didn't really make sense to me. I mean, why wasn't Rorge attacking at the same time? I guess that's really how I thought about it. I was fine with Arya doing the act. I feel like it makes sense in terms of her progression. I just didn't get why exactly it happened the way it did. It didn't really make sense logistically to me. So, although I get the thematic thing, and I think actually thematically it works, logistically it just raises too many questions. It makes me pull out of it a little bit. And although I like the little thing that she did with the list, again, it was like, oh, okay, that was easy. He's not wearing armor? I don't know. It's okay. I mean, I place this higher than some of the other ones because I liked their interactions. I liked how it was going. So I'm not going to really be mad at these particular segments, but I guess I feel like it could have been done better. That's my opinion. All right, let's move on. All right, so these last two storylines, I'm going to start with the King's Landing one. And there's sort of two things that are happening here. Of course, first we see the Mountain, and that's interesting just because we haven't really seen him before. And I guess they were trying to show how awful he is, how terrifying he is. And they did some good, camera work to show, how big he is. But just him killing a bunch of random prisoner people, that didn't really feel like it had an impact on me anyway. I mean, I would have liked to have seen him doing something more against actual fighters, I suppose, just to sort of demonstrate more how scary this is. It just seems like he's just a bully at this point, and we really want to get, really, I think, the terrifying nature of him. Because otherwise it doesn't seem as significant later on when Oberyn agrees to fight for him and when Bronn and Jaime turn him down. I guess I just wanted to see that. I did look, Cersei's coming through just like, blasé, whatever, guts, I don't care. And just sort of, yep, just do what I need you to do. That worked for me pretty well. I like that. I think it really fit with her characterization. And of course, all the Tyrion segments, I think, were kind of like masterful, just in terms of how they were shot, how they were acted. And there are some differences with the books, but there's no problems for me with how this was done. I thought that the progression made sense. You start with his theoretical best bet of his brother, which is sort of like, all right, bro, come on. Wouldn't it be funny if we both died? Which I like that they were picking up on his reasoning from last time, because that way it seemed like, oh, it wasn't just his emotion. He actually did have a reason, and it was because of his father, which is something that I said in my last review. So it makes sense. I like that. And it's sort of interesting to play against what they're embarrassed by. Jaime still seems like he's embarrassed by his relationship with his sister. And that's kind of surprising, because normally he doesn't seem to be embarrassed by much of anything. So why is that still a sore subject? Why is he always sort of touchy when Tyrion brings it up? That's interesting to me. I'm not really sure exactly how they're going to use to pay that off, or if they are, but I hope that that's building towards something. And one thing that's interesting is that there was a character that essentially did what Bronn had been doing in previous episodes, where he was helping Jaime train. And actually, I like those scenes. In the books, he was training with Sir Ilan Payne, who was the mute guy whose tongue had been ripped out, that was going to kill Cersei and the kids in a siege of the Blackwater. And apparently this guy had been suffering from cancer, and he just recently had a very successful treatment, so maybe we'll bring him back? I don't know. But of course, it's interesting to have that parallel back to Bronn, and I did like this. I thought the interactions made sense of Tyrion like, you sure? Sure you don't want to do this? And, Bronn's like, listen, our relationship is, yeah, well, as long as we're both on the same page here, it's fine, but we both know that neither one of us is really going to risk our lives for the other. And that made sense to me. I mean, I really feel like Tyrion, when all is said and done, he would do his best to help Bronn, but if it was his own life, I think he would work to that. I think that's always been something about Tyrion. He doesn't care enough about other people quite as much. I think he cares about ideals in some sense. I feel like there might have been a circumstance where he would have been willing to die if, say, it would have killed Joffrey, let's say. But this is a different matter. And it's one of those sort of interesting things where he's talking about, maybe I actually will just go out and just fight the Mountain because it will seem ludicrous. And it will be so obvious just how everything is against me. And I guess, I don't know, I remember at this point in the books, I really wasn't sure what was going to happen. So when you had this next segment, when Oberyn comes in and he tells these stories and he sort of, and then eventually he says, I'm going to be your champion. I mean, it's like, oh, well, I guess that makes sense. I mean, there's a little bit more to indicate that direction in the books, but I thought they did a great job here. Obviously, Peter Dinklage did an amazing job of just his listening to the story about Cersei and how awful she was just as a little girl. I think it's kind of interesting, and especially when you think about how it's described. Cersei was essentially trying to, literally emasculate him until Jaime stopped her. There's got to be some kind of metaphor there about their characters. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but there's something there. Anyway, obviously, that was a great interaction and a great setup to sort of get us pumped for the next one. So this was a great entire series of scenes, other than a little bit of deficiency with the mountain stuff. All the stuff with Tyrion was great. All right, now let's move on to our final storyline, which for me is tied for most interesting, but maybe not as most executed well. All right, so our Sansa storyline. This one it's complicated because I'm not entirely sure it was done the best it could have been done. One of the things that was in the books that they don't have here is that there was someone else hanging around. Now, I've heard some people complain, well, how come there's no one in the area? But that's reasonably consistent. Aside from the whole, well, they can't really afford to have that many people, there is a little bit of consistency of Lysa just not like having people around her, not trusting people. But there was this one particular singer, and this is something that had been set up. All right, I just got interrupted by a phone call, but we're going to cut that entirely out, so you shouldn't have heard any of that. No, really, I will cut it out. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying about this singer, basically he was there and was kind of sexually harassing Sansa, so we kind of hated him as book readers, and as soon as Lysa dies, Littlefinger's like, that was that guy. It's like, ooh, all right, interesting. So I really have no idea how Littlefinger could get out of this. I mean, what is he going to say? She tripped? You can't say he did it, I guess, unless it's some kind of self-defense thing. But even that is kind of a little flimsy. I mean, yes, she's a little crazy, so you could say, oh, well, she jumped for some reason. But, I mean, he can't blame Sansa because he doesn't want to blame Sansa. He wants to keep them both safe. Can he blame... Maybe he's going to blame Robin. Ooh, that would be interesting. Oh, wait, maybe that's where they're going to go with it. The truth is, I have no idea if they're actually going to go back to the Sansa storyline at all this entire season, because this is essentially where it ended in the books with this character. So, I don't know. This is interesting. But I feel like that's actually an interesting possibility. If they do that, I'll say, okay. I'll find that an interesting way of going about it. As it is now, I'm not sure. I mean, I've always said that I feel like the Littlefinger portrayal here is a little mustache twirly. I would have been your father. I know people say that's creepy. It's because it is creepy. It's this weird feeling about how he's attracted to Sansa, but he also feels like a father figure because he's not actually related to her, but she reminds him of her mom, who he was attracted to when he was a kid. He was obsessed with her. It's not really rocket science. He's messed up in the head. I don't know. It fits anyway because he's a creep. That's why it fits, because he's a creep. And I'm not sure about the scene with Sansa slapping Robin. I guess I understood logically why it happened. She was building the Winterfell thing, which is a connection. She hasn't really been connected with the North in forever, and finally she feels like, oh, this. And then first Robin sort of screws it up, and she's like, oh, you ruined it. But she wasn't saying that in a mean-spirited way, and then it just escalated until she slapped him. I don't know. I feel like, I don't know. Yeah, I think he wasn't doing anything quite bad enough to warrant a slap. But, On the other hand, I did like the continuation of Sansa showing herself to be more interesting and suspecting things, asking Littlefinger, why did you really do it? Because I don't really think there is just one reason. I think Littlefinger has a lot of reasons for it, and the whole Catelyn thing, I think, was really more like a bonus as opposed to a reason. So I like that. I like that Sansa is actually thinking things through and not just letting it slide by. All right, wrap it up. All right, so in general, I actually did like this episode. I thought it did have some weak parts, but the strong parts were so strong that I couldn't help but really give it a positive review. In general, I thought they did a good job. I'm obviously really psyched for the next episode, which, don't look it up online if you don't want to know what's going to happen, but it essentially says what we know is going to happen. We know that there's going to be interactions with some of these characters. I mean, I don't really know what's going to pay off and what's not. I mean, we haven't seen anything from Bran in a little while, and there's been some setup with that, so we assume something's going to happen this season. They haven't really finished off his storyline at all, so they have to do something. They haven't really done anything with Theon, per se, maybe with his thing. I feel like they're going to do a little bit more with Theon, just to sort of pay off a little bit more, and obviously we're going to have stuff with Jon Snow, considering they've been building that up the entire season, because otherwise he's not done very much at all. He got to the wall, he went up, he went back, and he's there again. It's very kind of static, and, I feel like we're going to have to meet the wildlings again, because again, that was something else that was built up that hasn't paid off yet. So, I don't know exactly which storylines are going to be included, but, I mean, listen, I think this is a pretty good season. I think they've made some mistakes here and there, but in general, I like what they're doing. I'm okay with basically almost all of the things that they've moved away from the book on, most of the time. I mean, a lot of times I'll say, well, let's just see how they pay this off. And sometimes they pay it off in a way and they're just like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But sometimes they don't, and I feel, oh, well, all right. Like sometimes I understand like a lot of things, like in season 1, the budget was very limited in a lot of ways, and they kind of had to cut a lot of corners, so I understand why they had to take certain liberties. And I think in some cases that might have screwed them up later on, so they're sort of playing catch-up on, oh, well, we couldn't do that then, so now we can't do this now. So, I have to cut a little bit of slack with that. But, these are all professional writers, so I feel like they should be able to do a pretty good job of tying things together. But I still give this episode an overall positive feeling. I mean, usually when I watch stuff on TV, I watch because I like the show, and that is also true for this show. So I guess I'll be talking more about this in 2 weeks. Thanks for stopping by.